What's up, fellow Spellslingers? It's Blue here from Blue Bears Games, and for today's video I'm going to show you a custom budget commander build that was recently ordered using Krenko Mob Boss with a budget of $50. I shouldn't really have to tell you what Krenko does, but just in case there are a few people who don't know, I will just to be sure. Krenko is a mono-red, 4-mana, 3/3 legendary goblin warrior with one of the most popular abilities in Commander. It allows you to simply tap it to create X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, where X is the number of goblins that you control. This ability may seem simple, but it allows you to build this deck in a variety of ways on both a small or a large budget and still be somewhat competitive regardless of what you chose to do. Krenko is one of the most popular commanders out there, and I've been asked to do this build several times. I've pretty much denied the request every time because of how many different ways it could be done, and I didn't want the deck to disappoint the new owner because I didn't build it the way that they envisioned. Finally, I realized that no matter what way I go, it will still be a fun build to play, and since I always show a deck list to the customers beforehand anyway, if any objections did arise, they could be addressed before finalizing the transaction anyway. So the direction that I chose to go was simply Goblin Tribal, with some token creation and an easy-to-understand infinite combo with a couple of ways to win besides just combat. So now let me show you what I came up with, but please keep in mind the budget was only $50, and because of their popularity, a lot of goblins that could have been used didn't fit the budget. I believe that this deck will be great regardless though, so let's get started and I'll show you what I came up with for this Krenko Mob Boss Commander build on a budget. So as I like to do, I will start with the land base. It's mostly basics, but there are some utility things there, and I'll start off with the first one is Hidden Volcano. There is one of these for each color. They are caves that come into play tapped. They tapped out a color of whichever one you chose, so there's one for each. And then it has this ability that you can pay 5 and tap it and sack it to discover 4, which is a quasi-cascade ability. It's really good, especially since this is a nice budget card that you can get that with. Memorial to War. Every time I do a deck, I like to tell you the same thing, that I like to put a land destruction land in every deck because you never know what you're going to face. Red just happens to have its own version of it from Dominaria. So it comes into play tapped, it taps that a red, and then you can pay 5, tap it, and sack it to destroy target land. And it doesn't have a caveat to that. It's any land, it doesn't say non-basic, and then other people don't get to do things on it like some of the colorless ones do. Forgotten Cave, because later in the game you might not want to draw a land, but if you do it and it's this one, you can cycle it away to draw a card, and it's the same thing with the Smoldering Crater. The difference between the two is one costs 1 red, the other one, and this one costs 2 generic. Goblin Burrows, at the very core of this deck, is technically a combat-based deck, and this is a Goblin Tribal deck too, so this one helps them a little bit. It comes into play untapped, it taps to add a colorless, and you can pay 1 red and 1 generic and tap it to have target Goblin creature get +2/+0 until end of turn. Blighted Gorge, another one that comes into play untapped, taps to add a colorless, and then you can pay 5, tap, and sack it to have it deal 2 damage to target creature or player. And this is going to seem like an odd inclusion because there is no real direct damage in this deck. However, that's the problem. Red is weak on removal, so this is just a land-based way of doing it, so I put it in there. And then, of course, we've got the Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse so that we can go ahead and go get some lands out of your library and put them into play. Thinning out your deck of land draws later, always good. And then again, I said it's only a couple of non-basics, and then all the rest of them are red basics here. And there's a lot of them. I don't know the exact number. I tell you every time I do one of these videos. The deck list will be in the description, so you can go ahead and see how many. The ramp section of this deck is going to be a little different. We're going to have 1 ramp card, and the rest is going to have actually utility instead. So I'm going to give you a Soul Ring here. I don't normally like to put Soul Rings in a lot of the budget decks I do just because I don't have a lot. However, there isn't a lot of ramp in this deck to begin with, and there isn't really a need for it. So I put it in here because, you know, it's a little bit more expensive than my normal $40 budget decks, so at least I can justify it. The rest of them are actually going to be cards like this, like a Renegade Map, a Traveler's Amulet, and Armillary Sphere. And the reason for these 3 is very simple. They're not really mana ramp, they're mana fixing. What they do though, is they do go and get lands out of your library and put them into your hand, and that's actually key, putting them in your hand, because the way Red does a lot of card draw is you have to discard cards. So these will go ahead and go get your useless lands later in the game that you want to just discard anyway to draw other fuel. So that's why these are in here. It's not really ramp per se. This is actually more utility, but it works as both. So if you do need the lands to put into play anyway, you can go ahead and get them and put them into play as your land for the turn. Next, I will go over the creatures of the deck. This is a Goblin Tribal deck, and as you can see, this is a very thick section. So I'm going to give it to you in the mana values as I go. So we're going to start with the 1-drops. Every one of these will have some sort of extra ability on top of just being a generic Goblin, okay? So on the 1-drops, we start with Hasters. Goblin Javelineer is one to cast 1/1 with haste, and then when it becomes blocked, it deals 1 damage to target creature blocking it. So basically, 1/1s blocking it, or anything with a 1 toughness, will die before it can deal the damage to it. Torch Courier, 1 to cast 1 with haste again, and then you can sacrifice it to give another creature haste until end of turn. You might not really need that, but it could be useful at some point. Tin Street Dodger, again, another 1 to cast 1/1 haster. Only now you can pay 1 red and have it not be able to be blocked except by creatures with Defender, so at least it can get through. Not a lot of people play Defender decks. Some do. Goblin Arsonist, the next couple ones are going to be like this. So it's 1 to cast 1/1 that you can, when it dies, you can deal 1 damage to any target, and then the next one's going to be the same thing. It's Fireblade Charger, again, another 1 to cast 1/1. As long as it's equipped, it has haste, which isn't really that big of a deal in this deck. But when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So at its base, it's a 1. So there are creatures in here that will buff your goblins, so it may even be more than 1. Mog Fanatic, similar but not really. It's a 1 to cast 1/1 that you have to sacrifice to get the 1 damage. So it's not that when it dies it does it. Now you actively have to do it. Exuberant Fuseling is a 1 to cast 0/1, has Trample, and then it gets +1/+0 for each oil counter on it. And the way that it gets oil counters is this. It says that when it enters the battlefield, or whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you put an oil counter on it. So it could actually, in a deck like this, which has a lot of ways to, I don't know, sacrifice some things and has a lot of tokens out, this can get really big on the power, just not the toughness. Foundry Street Denizen is a 1 to cast 1/1 that says whenever another red creature enters the battlefield under your control, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And remember, this is a Krenko deck. The whole point of this is to crank out a whole bunch of 1/1 goblins that are red, so this guy could also get big. Mog Raider, this is actually a really good tech card. It's a 1 to cast 1/1 that lets you sacrifice a goblin at any time, instant speed, whenever you need to or want to have target creature get +1/+1 until end of turn. So again, we're cranking out a lot of goblin tokens. They can be used as sacrificial lambs for the Raider to throw into, say, Krenko if you want to do commander damage, or for any other type of combat shenanigans. It's a really good card for this deck. Warbreak Trumpeter is the 1 to cast 1/1, but we're probably not going to cast it for that. It has an ability called Morph. Morph means that you pay 3 and cast it as a face down as a 2/2 just generic creature, and then you can morph it. The morph cost for this one is 1 red and XX, and if I need to explain XX to you again, let me know in the comments because it takes up too much time on the video. Then when it has the ability that when it is turned face up, you could put, it's actually create now, you create X 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and that could be really big depending on how you do it. There are some combos in here that I have that really can ramp up the mana for you. Goblin Instigator, 2 to cast 1/1, that when it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. Mog War Marshal is a 2 to cast 1/1 that has Echo, and the Echo cost is 2. Echo means that at the beginning of the upkeep, after it was cast, you pay the cost of whatever the Echo is, or you sacrifice it. And then his ability is that when he enters the play or dies, you put a 1/1 red goblin creature token onto the battlefield. Battlecry Goblin, he buffs a lot of your goblins, so he's a 2 to cast 2/2 that for every 1 red and 1 generic you put into him, goblins you control get +1/+0 and haste until end of turn. And then, whenever it attacks, if you attacked with creatures with total power 6 or greater this combat, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. So, token creation. I wanted as much token creation, plus some synergy with other things. This goblin specifically actually buffs all of your goblins, so that was really good synergy. Goblin War Driver, 2 to cast 2/2, has an ability called Battlecry that says whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Really helping with that, combat-based theme. Reckless Bushwhacker is a 3 to cast 2/1 with a Surge cost. Surge means that you may cast it for this cost if you've cast another spell this turn, or a teammate of yours has, but there's not really teammates unless you guys are playing, like, I don't know, Emperor. Then it has Haste, and then when it enters the battlefield, if it was cast with its Surge cost, other creatures you control get +1/+0 and haste. So a lot of buffing. Like I said earlier, that there is going to be a lot of buffing of creatures in this deck. Goblin Warchief is essentially a Lord, but a different kind of Lord. It's 3 to cast for a 2/2, and it has Goblin spells that you cast cost 1 generic less to cast, and Goblin creatures you control have haste. So not your typical Lord, where it gives a static buff of +1/+1. This one just makes your Goblins cost less and gives them haste. Grotag Knight Runner is a 3D cast 2/3 that says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, exile the top card of your library and you may play that card this turn. This is in here because you run out of fuel with red. When you run out of fuel with red, you're kind of dead in the water, and this helps add fuel so you can go ahead and cast things. It's not necessarily drawing cards for this version of a card. It's giving you the ability to cast stuff that you normally wouldn't be able to. Goblin Matron is a 3D cast 1/1 that when it enters play, you may search your library for a goblin card and reveal that card and put it in your hand. So any goblin in your deck. It's always pretty nice when you can do that. Spike Shot Goblin is a 3D cast 1/2, and I'm playing with this one because all the buffs in this deck make this actually a viable thing. So you can pay 1 red and tap it to have it deal damage equal to its power to target creature or player. So again, all those things that buff the power that I just showed you, you save this guy for at the end of the turn when all those buffs are still in effect, and you can go ahead and hit anything you want for, depending on how late in the game it is, for a pretty good amount. Stone Wave Invoker is a 3D cast 2/2 that for every 8 you put into it, it deals 5 damage to target player or planeswalker. I'm trying something here. This deck can find ways to produce a lot of mana, so I wanted some extra ways to deal damage for the person who gets this, because sometimes combat-based win cons don't really win all that often. Legion War Boss is a 3D cast 2/2 with Mentor. Mentor means that whenever this creature attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with a lesser power, and there are a lot of tokens that would benefit from that ability. And then, of course, at the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token, and that creature gains haste until the turn and attacks this combat if able. So speaking of those tokens, it creates the one token that it could mentor. The next one is the other Krenko. It's Tin Street Kingpin. Is a 3D cast 1/2 that whenever it attacks, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then create a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to its power. So when it attacks, especially if you've buffed it beforehand, you can create a lot of tokens with him. Goblin Rabblemaster, and yes, that is a buy a box promo foil. I have a bunch of them, so I'm glad to be able to finally use them. It is a 30 cast 2/2 that makes all of your other goblins have to attack each combat if able. But then it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token with haste. And then whenever Goblin Rabblemaster attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking goblin, so he can also get rather large. Volley Veteran is a 40 cast 4/2 that when it enters the battlefield, it deals damage to target creature and opponent controls equal to the number of goblins you control. Again, I said it earlier, not a lot of removal in this deck just because red's removal is lacking. So ways that I could find to do that, this is one of them. Goblin Ringleader is a 40 cast 2/2 with haste, and then when it enters the battlefield, reveal the top 4 cards of your library and put all the goblin cards that were revealed this way into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. Goblin Trap Runner, 40 cast 4/2. Whenever it attacks, you flip 3 coins, and for each flip you win, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token that's tapped and attacking. So for every one you lose, oh well. You can create a lot of tokens if you are a lucky person. Chimney Rabble is a 40 cast 3/3 with haste, and when it enters battlefield, you create a 1/1 red Phyrexian goblin creature token. Beetleback Chief is a 40 cast 2/2 that when it enters play, you create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. No haste on those. Battle Squadron is a 5 to cast star creature with flying. It's one of the very few goblins that has built-in flying and you don't have to pay for it. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control. Not just goblins, that doesn't really matter too much in this deck, but there is one non-goblin that I'll show you in a second. But it's equal to the number of creatures you control. And the last goblin is Siege Gang Commander. It is 5 to cast for a 2/2 that when it enters the battlefield, you create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. And for every 1 red and 1 and sacrificing of a goblin, Siege Gang Commander will deal 2 damage to any target. So with all the tokens that you have out, or that you can create with Krenko, this could be a very big damage dealing guy. So keep that in mind. And the only non-goblin I have in here is a card called Woody Roastmaster. 3 to cast for a 3/2, and it has an ability called Alliance that says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Woody Roastmaster deals 1 damage to each opponent. So if you're cranking out 20 goblin tokens with Krenko, 20 damage from Woody Roastmaster to everybody. That's why that's in there. The next section I'm going to go over is the utility stuff. I have it split up into 4 different sections of utility. I'll go over them each individually, and I'll show you the first section, which is token creation. So we start off with Krenko's Command and Dragon Fodder, since they are essentially the same card with just different names. They're both sorceries that cost 2 to cast, and both create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. So pretty simple. Next is Goblin Gathering. It's similar to the 2, only it costs more. It's 3 to cast. It creates a number of 1/1 red goblin creature tokens equal to the 2 plus the number of cards named Goblin Gathering in your graveyard. Sadly, this is a commander deck, so we're only going to get 1 use out of this and only get 2 tokens, but at least you get 2 tokens. You see a pair of goblins. I mean, it's in the name. Come on now. It's 3 to cast, and you get to choose to either have creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn, or create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. Both options are very useful in a deck that's combat-based and goblin-based, so great inclusion. Hordeling Outburst, 3 to cast sorcery that just creates 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. Empty the Warrens is a 4 to cast sorcery that creates 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and then has Storm, which is one of the best abilities in Magic. Storm says that when you cast this spell, copy it for each spell you've cast before it this turn. Very simple, but very powerful. Goblin War Party is 4 to cast, and you get to choose between 2 things again. You can either create 3 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, or have creatures you control get +1/+1 in haste until end of turn. But the good thing about this card is you can actually entwine it for 3 additional mana and choose both. So it's actually a pretty good one here. Goblin Assault is a 3 to cast enchantment that at the beginning of your upkeep you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token, with the caveat of goblin creatures have to attack each turn if able. I do have a way to negate that, and I will show you that in a little bit. And the last creature token maker is Goblin Slide. It's a 3 to cast enchantment that says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you may pay 1 generic, and if you do, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token with haste. The next section of utility will be the card draw. So I'll start off with Faithless Looting. It's a 1 to cast sorcery that lets you draw 2 cards and then discard 2 cards. And then it has Flashback, which means later on in the game you can actually cast it from your graveyard for 3, and then you exile it. Tormenting Voice, it's 2 to cast. As an additional cost to cast Tormenting Voice, you must discard a card, and then you draw 2 cards. And it's very similar to Throw of Possibility, which basically is worded the same way, except now you can do it at instant speed. And then Electric Revelation, very similar to those 2 as well. It's 3 to cast. Again, an additional cost to cast it is to discard a card, let you draw 2 cards, and then you can flash it back for 4, kind of like Faithless Looting did. The other way that Red does quasi-card draw is the ability like Rob the Archives has. It's a 2 to cast sorcery that has Casualty 1, which is kind of a cool ability. It says that you can copy the spell if you sacrifice a creature with power 1 or greater. But then the quasi-card draw is that you exile the top 2 cards of your library, and you may play those cards this turn. The caveat is, since it doesn't go into your hand, if you don't play them this turn, you lose them. So keep that in mind. Throes of Chaos is one that I like to put in there for decks that need not specifically just card draw, but to be able to cast things. So it's 4 to cast for a sorcery that has both Cascade and Retrace. And I will read what that means. It doesn't have any other abilities other than those 2. Cascade is one of the more powerful abilities in Magic. It says that when you cast a spell, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. So for this one, it costs 4 to cast, so anything that's 3 or less, you stop there, and then you may cast it without paying its cost. Then put the exiled cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. Okay? So you exile cards from the top of your library until you get something that costs less, you cast that spell for free, and then you move on. Then it has Retrace. Retrace says that you may cast this spell from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to its other costs. Are you starting to see why I put those not really ramp artifacts in here that go and get lands and put them in your hand? It's for things like the card draw here. So you have to discard stuff like with Throw of Possibility or to recast Throes of Chaos. And then if you need to put them into play, you can just do that as well. So it's not really, again, they're not really ramp, and that's not what they were for. They were for things for your card draw. Alright, and the last card for card draw is Seer's Sundial. It's a 4 to cast artifact that has a landfall ability. It says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 2 generic mana and draw a card. So repeatable card draw, especially since this deck's curve, the highest mana cost in here is I think 5, but most of the cards cost 2 or 3. So you will not need all the land that you draw. So that's why that's in there. The next set of utility cards I'll show you are the removal cards. Red does not have a lot of good removal. It's mostly artifact and then land. So I did what I could, and I tried to find as many cards that had dual purpose. So we start with things like a Braid. 2 to cast, you get to choose to either deal 3 damage to target creature or destroy an artifact. So you get at least more options than just destroying an artifact. Shattering Pulse does only destroy artifacts. However, it has a buyback. So for 2, you can cast it, and then you can buy it back for 3, destroy an artifact, and then repeatedly do that if you need to. Street Spasm is 1 red and X, and it will deal X damage to target creature without flying that you don't control, or you can overload it for 2 red and double X, and then you will replace all instances of target with each. So you will then deal X damage to each creature that you don't control without flying, so you can kind of wipe a board out if you need to. At least non-flying stuff. Chaos Warp is a card I don't really like that much, but because red is so weak on the removal, this is kind of needed. It's a 30 cast instant that says the owner of target permanent shuffles it into his or her library, then reveals the top card of their library, and if it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. Hopefully it's not a permanent card, and then nothing happens, but it's removal, regardless. Fissure is a card that I actually just started pulling out of my bulk because it is actual honest-to-God creature removal for red. It's 5 to cast at instant speed, so at least it's an instant that destroys target land or creature, and it can't be regenerated. That's what bury means. That's old terminology. The last couple of utility cards I will show you now are just pure utility. So things like Goblin War Drums gives all of your creatures menace, so good for combat. Ray Bombardment, it's a 3 cast enchantment that says whenever you attack with a creature with power 2 or less, Ray Bombardment deals 1 damage to the player or planeswalker that you're attacking, so extra damage during combat. Chiron Negotiation is probably one of the best cards in this deck. It's a 4 cast enchantment that says you can tap an untapped creature that you control to have it deal 1 damage to target player. Imagine all those tokens. It doesn't matter if they have haste because it's Chiron Negotiations tapping them. So you create all those tokens with Krenko. Now you can just tap him if they don't have haste to deal damage to anybody you want. That's a lot of damage if you think about it. It's a really good card for this deck. Goblin War Strike is the 1 cast sorcery that says it deals damage equal to the number of goblins you control to target player. So this could actually end up being, I'm going to use that number 20 again. 20 damage to the dome of one of your opponents. That may even remove him from the game. It's another good card here. And then, of course, Mirror Shield. If you've seen any of my other budget videos, you know that my way to protect the commander or anything important on the board that's a creature is with an equipment, and I usually do it on a budget. Mirror Shield is that budget card. It gives the equipped creature +0/+2. This weird thing with Death Touch, and then, of course, Hexproof. So the Hexproof is why I have it in here. And it only equips for 2, so it's actually quite cheap on both monetarily and mana-wise. The last thing that I want to go over for the deck is the combo. It's a pretty simple one. So it requires Krenko to be on the board and about 4 other goblins as well. And then we add in a Staff of Domination, which is the king of combo. It's 3 to cast. It has 5 abilities. The first one is to pay 1 and untap it. And that's how the combo really starts it going, because it untaps itself for just 1 generic mana. You don't really care about all the rest of them except for the one that says you pay 3, tap it, and untap target creature. So that's why I said with Krenko on the board and 4 other goblins, one of them being Skirk Prospector, which lets you sacrifice a goblin to add a red. So with these 2 on the board, Krenko and 2 other goblins, what you have there is the ability to sacrifice 4 of the tokens that you create with Krenko to create 4 red mana to be able to untap Krenko by paying 3 and tapping it with the Staff of Domination, and then paying 1 to untap the staff to do it again. Okay? So that's an infinite amount of creature tokens that are goblins that you can create with these 2 plus Krenko and another 2 goblins of any kind. What you do with that can be anything like using Impact Tremors, which says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it will deal 1 damage to each opponent, kind of like that non-goblin creature I showed you earlier. You can use Warstorm Surge, which is very similar to both Impact Tremors and the non-goblin that's in this deck. It says whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. Or you can sacrifice a whole bunch of goblins with Goblin Bombardment to deal 1 damage to a target creature or player. So that's the combo. It's very simple, very easy, and if you need any help understanding it, please let me know. Ask in the comment section.
And there you have it, folks. A mono red Krenko Mob Boss custom budget commander build on a $50 budget. There are some pretty neat interactions here, and the inclusion of Chiron Negotiations and an infinite token making combo should help the deck immensely if it runs into any issues winning with combat. I get why this is one of the more popular commanders out there, but for my taste, I'd rather run the OG Perforos and just put Krenko in the 99. Oh wait, I did do that! So that's all for this week, but I've actually got another custom-built commander deck for you next week that was ordered as a gift for the holiday. It had a slightly higher budget than today's video, and uses a commander that I've actually never seen or even thought about using before, so it's actually quite a unique build. Who is it, you ask? You'll have to check back next Friday to find out.